Today I'm going to be talking about the book I read most recently, which is The Institute by Stephen King. I'll be honest, the only reason that I read this book was because the protagonist, or one of the protagonists, I guess, is from Minneapolis, which is also where I'm from. It did have a really interesting sounding premise, but I really just read it because of the Minneapolis connection. But spoiler alert, I loved it. It's about a 12-year-old boy named Luke who is a genius, and he's from the Minneapolis area. And then one night he is kidnapped in the middle of the night. His parents are murdered, and he's taken to a place called the Institute, which is in the North Woods of Maine. It's in the middle of nowhere, and it is an institute for children with low-grade telekinetic and telepathic abilities. So he knew that he could move things with his mind, but it was so small what he could do, just making plates rattle and stuff, that he didn't really think anything of it. So while he's at the Institute, he meets a bunch of other kids and learns more about his abilities and learns more about the Institute itself. And there's a lot that goes on, so I won't really spoil it. I'll try not to spoil it. I won't give you a full summary. But he learns a lot more about like why he's there, the people in charge, and he meets other kids and learns more about his abilities. There's also another character that the book actually starts off with, which is a character named Tim, and he has this sudden urge to get off a plane and hitchhike around and move to all these different places, and he eventually ends up in a small town in South Carolina, maybe? Yeah, South Carolina, because they say it's like tobacco country, I think. So he eventually ends up in a small town in South Carolina where he becomes the night knocker, and he is like a former police officer who is somewhat haunted. I think he resigned after something happened that he felt he could have handled better. And so he's really excited to be the night knocker, and that's where his story starts off. At risk of giving too much away, their stories do come together in the end. I'm really not going to spoil anything about it. I'm just going to talk about my thoughts and what I really liked about the book and what I didn't really like about the book. One of the first things I have to say that I really liked about the book was how it is divided into smaller subsections. Not even really chapters, they almost feel like smaller novellas within a bigger novel. And I think that because there's multiple parts to the story, kind of, and multiple characters that fit together, this is a really good way to do it. And I just really liked that format a lot because it helped you understand what you're focusing on for each section, which, yeah, I just really like that format. And even within those sections are even smaller subsections. It's not a crazy long book, but it's not short either, so it's nice to have those divisions for when you're really looking, you can't stop reading and you're looking for a good place to stop. Then they kind of give you a place where you're like, okay, I'll stop here. And that's necessary in this book, because that brings me to the second thing about it that I guess I liked. It's just that it's a real page turner in the true sense of the word. Like, you just keep wanting to read. And not every book is like that. Even other good books aren't necessarily like that. I had troubles putting it down. I actually would choose to read this over like responsibilities that I actually had to do. I would say that that's a really good quality about this book, is it's a great page turner and you really want to see what happens, which is why I'm trying so hard not to spoil it. But it's definitely one of those books where you keep reading because you're like, oh my gosh, what's gonna happen? What's gonna happen? I mean, not surprisingly, given who the author is, but the physical descriptions of the surroundings were actually probably one of the best parts of this book, because it definitely put me there. I could envision the Institute so clearly in my mind. And to me, that is something that helps really put you in the story as well. So going back to it being like a page turner, that's something that puts you in the story. And it's something that makes you want to keep reading because you can picture it so vividly. And that was definitely the case with the physical descriptions of like the area and the spaces. One thing that I liked but also didn't like was that during the climax, he switched location so often. It's not a bad thing. It's good to go back and forth between the different storylines, but I almost felt like it was happening too much at that point. So that would be a little bit of a complaint that I had. It was an effective way to build extra suspense, but it also frustrated me a little bit when I had to like keep going back and forth, where I'm like, okay, but tell me a little bit more about what's going on here, because I just kind of, I don't know, it was a little bit frustrating, but at the same time it built amazing suspense. So I can't say it was fully something that I didn't like, but I also can't say it was fully something that I liked. Something that I thought was really nice about this book was that even though the protagonist, Luke, is 12 years old, he is so smart for his age that he's a really easy protagonist to like identify with as an adult. And he's somebody that you really want to root for. He's got all of this intelligence, but at the same time still a little bit of that childlike naivete in a way. So I really did like that character, and I also felt like his character combined with the other children characters at the Institute made for a team that you were really rooting for, somebody that you wanted to keep reading about, all of the kids you kind of wanted to keep reading about. And so I really liked that aspect as well, because I think that their dynamic with each other was realistic. Their interactions with each other reminded me a lot of how I would interact with other kids when I was 12 or 13 or 14. Speaking of their dynamics, this book actually reminded me a lot of when I was younger and I was in a psychiatric hospital for depression. And this reminded me a lot of my stay there and the way that you can kind of hyper intensely bond with other kids going through like difficult things. Obviously we weren't being tortured because of our psychic ability. That was something that maybe for me personally helped transport me that much more into the story and helped me relate it back to something that I knew pretty well. So I think having that experience definitely made me relate to this even a little bit more and kind of understand and sympathize with the way the kids might be feeling that much more, because it did remind me of that environment so much. Other than the story switching and location switching during the climax, there weren't a lot of things that bothered me about this book. I really didn't like Mrs. Zigsby, who's like the woman in charge at the Institute. You were meant to not like her, but something about her character felt a little flat to me. So that's, if I had like one complaint, I would say the other characters made sense to me. Maureen, like all of the other characters, adult or child, made sense to me, but Mrs. Zigsby was a little bit of a weird one to me. She did feel very two-dimensional. She felt almost like a caricature of what she was supposed to be. And so I have a little bit of that complaint, because that could have probably been fleshed out. We know very well that this is an author who's capable of doing that, so the fact that that character remained so two-dimensional was a little bit of a disappointment. However, the rest of the book was so stellar and so well written and so interesting that I wouldn't list that as like a reason to not read it, or even say that that's a reason it's not well written. I would say there was one character that he really didn't focus on, and that's okay. I would definitely recommend reading it if you like thriller, mystery, horror, scary novels. If you don't like that, don't read it. It's a very suspenseful book. And I like suspenseful, but I'm super susceptible to it, so I was like, what's gonna happen next? What's gonna happen next? If you don't like that feeling, don't read it. But I highly recommend it. It was actually better than I thought it would be. I'd give it probably like 5 out of 5 stars, honestly. So I definitely recommend it. I am curious about other people who have read this, what your thoughts are, specifically what your thoughts are on the characters of Luke and Mrs. Zigsby, also just the story as a whole, especially the ending. I'm not going to say anything about the ending in case you haven't read it, but I really liked the ending and it felt right to me, but I'd be interested if other people liked it as much as I did, because it seems like an ending that even though I liked it, I could definitely see people not liking it. So if you've read this, let me know if you also liked the ending. But yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I will see you later.